Chapter 6: Japan and the Island of Dejima. History sometimes loves to take unexpected turns. It seems that everything is going according to plan. Peaceful trade, spices afleet at ports. But suddenly, an English sailor appears on the scene. His ship is driven to the shores of Japan, and the random navigator becomes a samurai. This is not a figment of imagination or a myth. It's a story of William Adams. It all began in 1600, when a Dutch trading expedition, equipped to find new markets in Asia, reached the shores of Japan. It was one of those bold attempts when 5 ships, laden with hopes, goods, and sailors, set off into the unknown, guided only by the wind, stars, and fragmented rumors. On one of these ships, as a navigator, sailed William Adams, an Englishman hired by the Dutch for his knowledge of maritime affairs. The ship sailed along the coast for a long time. Some of them perished, others went off course. The remaining ship, exhausted, with a sick crew and almost no supplies, drifted to the Japanese shore. The sailors were arrested. The Europeans looked strange, spoke a foreign language, carried suspicious goods, and, in the opinion of local officials, could well have been pirates or spies. They were taken to Osaka, the residence of the powerful shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. From this moment, Adam's amazing story begins. He was interrogated. The Portuguese, who already had influence in Japan, actively began to slander the Dutch and English, claiming they were pirates, invaders, spreaders of Christianity, and a threat to Japanese stability. But Adams spoke reasonably. He talked about trade, about science, about nautical instruments. He didn't try to baptize Japanese, and he didn't try to lie. His judiciousness pleased Tokugawa. Gradually, step by step, the navigator became the shogun's advisor, and then even a samurai. Yes, as European samurai with a title, a house, a wife, and children. He could not return to Europe. He simply wasn't allowed to leave. But he wasn't eager to either. He wrote letters home, sent money to his first family in England, but lived a new Japanese life. His name even gave a name to one of Tokyo's districts. Adams became a bridge between Europe and Japan. Through him, the Dutch began to build relations with the closed country. He was a window through which the East looked at the West, and vice versa. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were losing ground. Their Jesuit missionaries spread Christianity with considerable persistence. They built churches, taught locals, and incited rebellions. At some point, the Japanese felt that behind the missionary speeches lay an attempt to interfere in their internal affairs. When a major Christian rebellion broke out in Shimabara in 1637, the Japanese perceived it as a final threat. Shogun Tokugawa decided to isolate himself from the rest of the world. All Europeans, except the Dutch, were expelled. Trade was forbidden, and missionaries were executed. The only exception was made for VOC. Why? Because the Dutch didn't try to convert to Christianity, didn't interfere into politics, and didn't build churches. They wanted to trade, simply and clearly. And this suited the Japanese. The Dutch were allowed to stay, but on one condition: they would not set foot on sacred Japanese soil. For this purpose, the artificial island of Dejima was built in the shape of a fan dropped by Shogun. In this tiny piece of land stood warehouses, barracks, and an infirmary. The Dutch were only allowed to trade and reside there. They couldn't enter the city, marry Japanese women, and children born from relationship with locals were taken away upon reaching a certain age. Control was total. But this island was golden. Even despite the restrictions, the Dutch earned huge sums of money: silver, porcelain, Tonkin silk, lacquered goods, and tea. By some estimates, profits from trade with Japan reached 45,000%, not annually, but from a single voyage. And all this became possible because once an English navigator, not a Spaniard, not a Portuguese, not a missionary, spoke calmly, confidently, without preaching, and was heard. And somewhere on the other side of Asia, at the same time, a wave of unification was rising. The Dutch understood this couldn't go on. All these expeditions, scattered factories, competition among themselves, too many losses, too little control. One structure was needed, one force, one company. Chapter 7: The birth of a corporation with an army and fleet. Sometimes it seems that the history of corporations began quite recently, with offices in glass skyscrapers, presentations and stock exchanges, with logos and shares. But long before Apple, Google, and Amazon, long before investment funds and boards of directors, in 1602, the first truly transnational capitalist, armed corporate empire appeared in Northern Europe. It was called Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC for short, the Dutch East India Company. This was not just a merchant association, it was a new format of power. The emergence of the VOC became a turning point not only in the history of trade, but also in the history of governance, finance, and even colonialism. To understand how revolutionary it was, one needs to imagine the following facts. First, the company had a monopoly right to trade with the East. This meant that no other Dutch organization, no merchant, no independent adventurer had the right to conduct business in the East Indies. Everything went through the VOC. Second, the company was subordinate to the state but was managed by private investors. The main oversight was exercised by the States General, the Parliament of the young Dutch Republic, but real power was held by the Council of 17 Lords, the wealthiest merchant families in the country. Third, the VOC had the right to mint its own currency, conclude international treaties, build fortresses, negotiate with monarchs, declare wars, and maintain an army and a fleet. That is, it practically possessed all the rights of a sovereign state. The world had never seen such a hybrid of business and power. But there was something else, something that made the VOC a truly epoch-making structure. Shares. Yes, right here in 1602, in Amsterdam, the first stock exchange in history appeared. VOC shares could be bought, sold, and inherited. They were bearer shares. Anyone with money, from an aristocrat to a wealthy artisan, could invest in the company and receive a share of the profits. The revenues, by the way, were astronomical. Within a couple of years, the shares rose by over 100%, and then even more. Initially, dividends were paid in spices, literally bags of pepper, cloves, and saffron. Later, they switched to money. And this was not just investing, it was participation in a global transformation. By buying a VOC share, you essentially became an accomplice in an expedition, the capture of a fort, the establishment of a monopoly, the blockade of a strait. Your dividends smelled of the colony. All this happened even before Newton formulated the law of universal gravitation, before America became independent, before the Napoleonic Wars, before the Industrial Revolution. The VOC was capitalism in its purest form, only under sails and with cannons. The company quickly began to expand across Asia. Its ships sailed to China, Japan, Ceylon, to the coast of India, and to the islands of Indonesia. They established factories, forts, garrisons, and if someone refused to trade, an army arrived. A private army. Yes, the VOC was the first in the world to create what we call today a private military company. Moreover, these were not just mercenaries. It was a real system with a charter, hierarchy, and discipline. VOC soldiers fought against the Portuguese, local sultans and pirates, and in some cases against the British. But they didn't just escort caravans. They conquered territories, established regimes, built fortresses, and suppressed rebellions. The VOC army sometimes outnumbered the regular armies of European states of that time. The company fleet was also impressive. In various years, the VOC fleet numbered up to 150 merchant ships and up to 40 warships. It was an entire maritime world, a flotilla cruising between ports, transporting spices, silver, slaves, porcelain, tea, textiles, and weapons. And at the center of all this was the logo, the world's first corporate logo, which was printed on merchandise boxes, ship flags, and documents. A simple clear letter V intertwined with O and C. To this day, it looks concise and modern. Even in this, the VOC was ahead of its time. The Dutch East India Company became more than just a merchant association. It became a superstructure, a new form of empire in which money was more important than origin, and profit was more important than the crown. It was a model of the future that came too early, or perhaps just in time. While Europe debated faith and kings, the VOC was already calculating profitability and investing in military expeditions. It is from this moment that one can date the heyday of the VOC empire, and with it, the beginning of the European colonial order in Asia. But to retain wealth, shares, and ships alone are not enough. One must conquer, subdue, and reshape the world to one's will. And this will be undertaken by the next hero of our story, a man whose name became a symbol of Dutch colonialism. Chapter 8: The Exchange, Shares, and Profit from Spices. When the VOC began operating at full capacity, Europe saw for the first time what super profit meant on a scale exceeding even the wildest fantasies. These weren't just successful trading voyages. These were operations in which everyone, every clove, every speck of nutmeg literally turned into gold Imagine a ship returning from the East Indies, laden to the brim with spices, silk, and Chinese porcelain. It's greeted like a ship returning from El Dorado. Its hold is a treasure chest, only with diamonds, only without diamonds, but with tons of pepper. And this profit is tangible, fragrant, spilling through your fingers. In 1603, one of the VOC officers, Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk, captured a Portuguese merchant ship named a Santa Catarina off the coast of Singapore. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating palace packed with porcelain, silk, and silver from China. The VOC sold its cargo in Amsterdam and earned a sum equivalent to 3.5 million guilders. To give you a sense of scale, an admiral received 1 million as personal income from just one voyage. The understanding of such profits spread quickly. Merchants eagerly invested in VOC shares. They sold like hotcakes. The initial cost of one share was 3,000 guilders, an enormous sum, but within a few years, the shares rose in price by 130%, and then even more. This was the first real stock market boom in world history. Initially, dividends were paid in the form of spices. You literally received a bag of pepper, cloves, and a little of saffron. Later, they switched to monetary payments, and this was not just investing, it was participating in a global transformation. By buying VOC share, you essentially became an accomplice in an expedition, the capture of a fort, the establishment of a monopoly, and the blockade of a strait. The dividends smelled of economy. At the same time, the VOC was establishing itself on Java, Sumatra, Bantam. Factories were found there, warehouses and fortresses, walls were built, and each new fortification was a step toward complete monopoly. The Dutch didn't just want to participate in the spice market, they wanted to own the entire market. It was for this very purpose that the political, military, and economic infrastructure was built. It was during this time that the Dutch also reached Calcutta, the capital of Oriental luxury. There they saw not bags of pepper, but sapphires, emeralds, gold, and ivory. A factory was also established there, and another story began, the story of the VOC immersion in India, and into what the English would later transform into the British Empire. But the Dutch were there first. However, with wealth came danger. This entire ocean was now overflowing with rivals. The Portuguese tried to reclaim what they had lost, while the English, on the contrary, increased their influence. And every ship sent to the East Indies might not return. 1 out of 3 ships would perish in a storm from illness or as a result of a pirate attack. But the remaining 2 still paid for everything handsomely. And this was a unique characteristic of the VOC. They even calculated this. The company developed a mathematical risk model that allowed them to insure cargo. Operations were calculated down to the percentage probability of a ship's loss and the quantity of spices sold. This was not just an adventurous voyage, it was a cold business, precise and ruthless. And all of this was done for bags of pepper. But in those bags was much more than just spices. There was money, power, control, influence, strategy, and even ideology. The VOC at that time became a real machine. It knew no mercy, felt no doubts. It opened new routes, seized new markets, integrated Europe into Asia and vice versa. It changed the very essence of world trade. But this machine needed a man who would take control, a man who would transform the chaos of factories and ships into an empire. Such a man was approaching, and his name was Jan Peterson Cohen. Chapter 9: Batavia, or How to Build a Capital in the Jungle. If the VOC was an empire, then it needed a capital, not a temporary factory, not a fort with a flag on the tower, not a tent with bags of pepper, but a real center of power, administration, trade, and logistics. And this center emerged not in The Hague, not in Amsterdam, but in the very heart of Indonesia, on the island of Java. It was named Batavia, and it was built by a man whose name became almost legendary, Jan Peterson Cohen. Cohen is a multifaceted figure. He was not just an administrator, he was an organizer, a military strategist, and without any exaggeration, the architect of the VOC as a political organism. He understood that scattered factories would not maintain a monopoly, that the chaos of trading posts had to give way to a strict system. He began to build this system from a land that had nothing but swamps, jungles, and hostile tribes. A factory was trading settlement or fortified warehouse that European powers established in their colonies. Merchants lived there, goods were stored, and deals were made with locals. Simply put, it was an operational base for overseas trade. So, in 1619, Cohen chose their site for a new base, a small port called Jayakarta, owned by a local sultan. It was located as a strategic point in northwestern Java, ideally suited for controlling sea routes. There was only one problem. The city was already occupied, and the Sultan had no intention of giving it up. Cohen's solution was simple: assault and burning. The city was razed to the ground. Its inhabitants were expelled or annihilated. In its place, Cohen ordered the establishment of a new capital, Batavia, named after the ancient Germanic tribe of the Batavians, from whom the Dutch believed they originated. This was a symbolic act, a European nation building a new civilization on the other side of the world. And indeed, Batavia quickly became a showcase of Dutch dominance. Canals appeared there like in Amsterdam, stone warehouses, paved streets, markets, a harbor, and fortress walls. The city was divided into districts, one for the Dutch, another for Chinese merchants, a third for slaves. Everything was strictly ordered, clear, geometric, just like the entire VOC system. Batavia housed the Governor General, the highest VOC official in Asia. Here, orders were written, deals were concluded, and disobedient individuals were tried. Batavia became the heart of the corporation, the place from which all Asian operations were managed, from Ceylon to Japan, from India to Banda. The beauty of the city was built on blood. To create Batavia, it was necessary not only to win, but also to hold. Locals rebelled, nature resisted, swamps reluctantly yielded land, and malaria claimed hundreds of lives. Slaves were brought by the thousands from Africa, Madagascar, and Borneo. Batavia shone, but beneath its cobblestones lay the bones of thousands of people whose names no one remembered. Cohen nevertheless continued the work. He subjugated neighboring cities, established diplomatic relations with the Japanese, and eliminated competition in the region. His approach was simple. If an agreement could be reached, great. If not, they would come with cannons. He did not believe in long-term alliances, but believed in the power of fear and control. And it worked. Under his leadership, the VOC reached new heights. The sums passing through Batavia amounted to millions of guilders. Ships arrived and departed weekly. From here, caravans of porcelain, silk, tea, opium, coffee, and tobacco were sent. Batavia became a logistical marvel of the 17th century, a global distribution center connecting east and west. And yet, it was a ghost town, a scarred city. Beneath its polished surface lay fear, death, and strict segregation by race, religion, and origin. The Dutch lived separately, the Chinese separately, the locals even further apart. Slaves were not allowed on the streets after sunset, and punishment for rebellion or escape were barbaric. This was an order built on hierarchy and discipline. Nevertheless, Batavia functioned, and as long as it lived, so did the VOC. Because without this capital, without its harbor, its warehouse, its treasury, everything else would have crumbled. It was here that the corporation reached its maturity. And meanwhile the sun rose over the city, reflecting in the canals built in the image of Amsterdam. Ships hummed in the harbor, dividends grew, and it seemed that nothing could shake this colonial machine. But even a perfect system falters, especially when it comes to people, especially when profit is more important than consciousness. Chapter 10: Spices and Cannons, the Banda Islands Massacre. Monopoly, a word that sounds dry and encyclopedic. But behind it lies thousands of bodies, rivers of blood, and cities that have vanished from the face of the earth. The Dutch India Company, having reached maturity, decided to cement its position not merely through markets or treaties, but through complete control. Control over the very sources of spices. And the first item on that list was the Banda Archipelago. The Banda Islands are the few tiny dots on the map, lost in the Malacca Sea. They are minuscule, but it was here at the time that 100% of the world's nutmeg grew. No other region could offer this pungent, oily, intoxicating fruit. If you held Banda, you held the entire global nutmeg market, and the Dutch understood this. Initially, the VOC tried to act civilly. Representatives of the company negotiated with local rajas, concluded treaties, and agreed on exclusive supplies. But the islanders, who had traded with Arabs, Chinese, Portuguese, and even English for centuries, were in no hurry to surrender to the mercy of a single company. They refused to give all their harvest solely to the Dutch. They continued to trade on the side. For the VOC, this was unacceptable. In 1621, under the leadership of Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a punitive expedition was organized. A detachment of several hundred armed soldiers arrived from Batavia, joined by Japanese mercenaries. Terror began. The Dutch landed on the islands one by one. Villages were burned, men were seized and tortured, demanding confessions of smuggling. Women and children were enslaved. The Rajas, the traditional leaders of the islands, were ordered to be hanged or publicly beheaded. All of this was accompanied by the formalization of supposedly legal contracts for the transfer of all lands to the VOC. According to modern estimates, up to 90% of the island's population was exterminated through massacre, famine, fight, and subsequent epidemics. The few who survived were turned into laborers on the plantations, which were now under complete control of the VOC. Thus began monoculture, the practice of growing only one product, in this case, nutmeg. This allowed the company to control the entire harvest, all supplies and all prices. The East India Company no longer competed. It became the sole owner of everything. It now considered both the land, the people, and the spices themselves as its property. For logistics and security, fortresses were built on the islands, garrisons were created, and slaves were imported from other regions because there were simply no locals left. Production proceeded under supervision, and any act of disobedience was punished by death. Spices were now obtained not only by hand, but also by blood. Meanwhile, in Europe, all that remained of these horrors were thin jars of powder in the kitchens of the aristocracy. A little grated nutmeg in wine, and the evening became exquisite. No one thought that behind that pinch lay burned villages and forgotten peoples. The sweet scent of nutmeg concealed the bitterness of ash. From the VOC's perspective, the operation was successful. Control over the nutmeg market became absolute, profits stable, and its reputation fearsome. The other islands and merchants understood resistance would be punished not with fines but with extermination. Later, when the British eventually reached one of the Banda Islands, Rum, and even briefly captured it, this would become a point of future negotiations. The VOC would want this patch of land back and would exchange it for the islands of Manhattan. But more on that later. For now, silence reigns on Banda, not of peace, but of the absence of people. Spices ripened, were packed, sent to Batavia, and from there to Amsterdam. And again to the markets, again to the banks, again to shareholders' reports. And again dividends, only without mentioning how many heads those percentage costs. This was the price of monopoly, and this was only the first reckoning with the counterparties. Ahead lay Formosa, Ceylon, India, and Cape Colony, and everywhere according to the same scheme.